Hi, guys. Welcome to the Science Cafe. Is this going out? Yeah, it is. All right. So, a couple of announcements. For those of you that do or don't know, I'm Sarah Wyatt. I'm the Vice President of the Sigma Xi chapter here at Ohio University. And a couple of announcements specifically for Sigma Xi or for people who'd like to participate. The Sigma Xi grants in aid for research are due March 15th. This is an opportunity for students to write grants to Sigma Xi, the national organization, for some funding to do your research. So you might think about that. March 15th is the deadline. Don't wait till then. You actually need letters of recommendation, so you need to start thinking about it now. Also, the Student Expo. For those of you who didn't hear it last week or the week before, or who don't know about it, the Student Expo goes on every year. This year it's on April 9th. It's a Thursday. A huge number of students from the university, roughly 800, will be presenting, and you should be one of them. You need to register before February 27th. The registration will close this year at 800, and I know that seems like a big number, but trust me, it will fill up. So if you're thinking you'll wait till the afternoon of the 27th, you're not going to get in. So go ahead and register now. Talk to your advisors, and all you really need is a title to register. And then, of course, by April 9th, you actually have a product, whatever that is. So any research or creative activity that you're doing as a student, it's a great opportunity to highlight all of those activities at the university. All right. Next week, we haven't done one of these in a while. Next week, we're going to have a cafe conversation. This is Chester Patch out of history, and he's going to be talking about the 1980s, the age of Reagan and Madonna. Could be an interesting conversation. And then on February 18th, 2 weeks from today, we're going to have Elizabeth Kordash from the Geological Sciences talking about reconstructing a Jurassic landscape. So things to look forward to. You should be coming back here like every Wednesday. There's always something going on. But right now we have David Rosenthal from the plant biology department who's going to talk to you about global climate change. It's all yours, Dave.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm not used to being on a mic, excuse me. So I'm going to talk to you today about global climate change and agricultural productivity in the broad sense. And so the question really is, how is global productivity, I feel like this is really loud, global productivity going to be affected by climate change? Are crop yields going to go up or down? It's going to affect us all in some way because we all depend on plants either directly or indirectly for all of our calories, right? So I'd like to contrast two kinds of agriculture. On the top we have industrial farms. And on the bottom we have small local farms. This is an example of an organic farm here in town, Green Edge. They have great greens. I don't know if you've been to the farmer's market. Anybody here been to the farmer's market recently? All right, so that's probably why you're here, right? You're interested in agriculture, and you're interested in what might happen to it. So I want to contrast these two because I'm actually going to be talking about what's on the top of the screen, unfortunately, not what's on the bottom, even though most of the produce I purchase and most of the vegetables I'm interested in eating come from the bottom part of the frame. And that's a choice I've made. You don't have to make that choice. And so this talk is sort of understanding how both of these systems, whether it's industrial agriculture or local small farm agriculture, how plants in both of those systems will respond to climate change, right? So what are some things that are going to happen to plants in climate change? Anybody? Change in the growing season. Okay. Okay, go ahead. So potentially drought. Potentially too much water, too much drought, too much heat. What else? Changing the latitude, so where you grow things now is going to change, maybe. In fact, that's true. A lot of the models suggest that Ohio is going to be more like Arkansas by the end of the century. climatically speaking, that is, right? Okay, so we've got drought, we've got rain. What else did we talk about? Temperature. Carbon dioxide. Yeah. So what's this about carbon dioxide? Excuse me? Oh. So carbon dioxide, is it going up or down, or how's that going to affect plants? So what I've decided to do today is actually have you actually give us all the information. I don't have anything prepared. So what is it about crops and plants and CO2 in particular? What is that link? Yeah. So plants take up carbon dioxide, and as a byproduct, they release oxygen. That's true. I'm actually breathing out a lot of CO2 right now. Okay, so plants are critical in sort of understanding the response of the global biosphere to this increase in carbon dioxide. Where's the carbon dioxide coming from? Fossil fuels? Okay, what's a fossil fuel? Who said that? All right, what's a fossil fuel, and why does carbon dioxide come from there? Can you get carbon dioxide if you use a wood stove? So really, if you burn anything that's organic, it doesn't have to be a fossil fuel, which we haven't defined yet. So what's a fossil fuel? What is it? Why is it called a fossil fuel? It's been around for a long time, right? It's the result of decay from eons ago, right? It's a fossil, essentially. Okay, so that matters. So what have we done to global atmospheric CO2? This is what's known as a Keeling curve in the science world. And how many of you have seen this curve in some form or another? Okay, so since you all know what's on this curve, could somebody tell me what this curve describes? The rise in CO2 levels. Okay, let's look at the axes, because when we talk about graphs, we always want to talk about axes. So what's on the bottom? Can you see that? Year? Okay. And what's on the y-axis? Parts per million. Parts per million, that's nothing. That's tiny, right? Who cares? I mean, we're talking about the difference between 300 and 400 parts per million over, I don't know, what is that, 40, 50 years? Who cares? Dead silence. So well, the plants are going to respond to this, but we should care. We're not plants, but we should care. So why should we care? It's a greenhouse gas. So what's a greenhouse gas? It contributes to global warming. So it does, in fact. So what other things produce CO2 naturally, for example? Are there natural sources of CO2? Volcanoes. Industrial farming, yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, like those tractors we were talking about, sure. Cement production, well, that's us again. Respiration, globally speaking. Forests respire. Animals respire. So there's this global CO2. Yes? Decomposition of organic matter. Thank you, Dr. DeForest. So decomposition of organic matter is very sensitive to temperature and actually releases CO2 as you increase the temperature, decomposition increases, okay? So let's think about this in a different scale. So now we're talking parts per million, and I'm telling you, who cares about parts per million? So let's look at this in terms of mass balance. Now, what do I mean by mass balance? So part per million is nothing, right? Can you even measure a part per million of salt? Right? No. So what we're looking at here is mass balance. And so if you think of the whole biosphere as a bottle, and you think of a concentration of a part per million, what is the mass of that part per million over the entire globe? You see where I'm going with this? Okay, so, those weren't supposed to show up yet. So it turns out that if you look at on a mass balance, what we're doing is we're contributing 9 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere through our fossil fuel burning. 9 billion tons. Plants, we were talking about them, they're important. They take up about 3 billion tons of carbon. The oceans absorb approximately 2 billion tons of carbon. So what that means is on any given year, okay, this is an annual budget, on any given year, atmospheric carbon net annual increase is 4 billion tons of carbon per year. That's a huge amount, right? So when we talk about carbon dioxide increasing 2 parts per million per year, it seems tiny. But if you think about it in terms of mass balance, it's a huge change in the global carbon cycle. So why do I care about carbon? Well, it turns out that I care about carbon because photosynthesis, which is what I study, is the entry of carbon into the biosphere. So anything that uses carbon biologically really starts from this process, right? So it's the entry of carbon into the biosphere, into living things. All right, let's move to the next controversial topic, or not. So this is, anybody recognize this figure? Does it look like a hockey stick? Anybody heard of ClimateGate? So this is part of that diagram. And so essentially, or a similar diagram, and essentially what this summarizes is a temperature anomaly. So, okay, so what's a temperature anomaly? This is important because a lot of these graphs we see in the news every day talk about temperature anomalies. Does anybody here know what a temperature anomaly is? What the y-axis actually means? So basically, you can choose any chunk of time and say, this is what I want to compare the change to. And so in this case, the temperature anomaly is what is the change between 1940 and 1960, I think. So it's right around this area, okay? That makes sense. If you look at the change, anything above this line is an increase in the average temperature for that period, and anything below this line is a decrease for the average temperature between that period, right? Okay, straightforward. Why am I showing this to you? Yeah. So the global temperature measured, now this is not like modeled or estimated, this is actually measured, is going up. Okay, so what? Excuse me? It's increasing. So what you're saying is here it's going up and here it flattens out, but here it's really increasing. So what? I don't know. Well, we could go a lot of places with this. Anybody want to go anywhere with this? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, the trend is kind of scary. But I mean, you know, what's up? Maybe this is over here. We don't really know that, or do we? Can we? Can we know that? Right. I see what you're saying. This looks like it's increasing, but who's to say that from 2014 to 2034 there's going to be no increase in CO2? Anybody believe that? I mean, okay, but okay. So we could say it's increasing. How about if we ask ourselves if there's other data that might indicate why this is going on, right? And so it turns out, of course, these are all very well selected figures, okay? It turns out that the Mauna Loa chart, the one with the CO2 increasing in an increasing way, right? It's accelerating as it increases, starts here. Unfortunately, we don't have Mauna Loa data back here, right? So we don't know if Mauna Loa was flattening out during this period. So we can't really find causation there, right? Did anybody go to Ryan Vogt's talk in September? No? Good. So this won't seem like a repeat. So I watched that one. I wasn't at that talk. So it turns out that the Mauna Loa record and this temperature record coincide. Big deal. Well, we can't look forward in time. Maybe we can look backwards in time. And so what I'm showing you now is a whole lot of data. And basically all you need to know from this is that these are temperatures estimated from oxygen isotope data. What's an isotope? Anybody remember what an oxygen isotope is? What's carbon dating about? What do we look at when we carbon date something? Come on, sci-fi enthusiasts. Carbon-14. So carbon-14 is a carbon isotope. There's carbon-14, 13, 12, okay. And oxygen has isotopes. And it turns out that if we look back through time, oxygen isotopes tell us a lot about global temperature. And there's a lot of very solid science to explain that, which is completely beyond me. And then there's also ice core data. We can look at CO2 concentration over time in the same ice cores. So you can get the same bit of ice, and you can get knowledge about the temperature and the carbon dioxide concentration in that ice, and you can carbon date it, so you know how old it is, and suddenly you have a an understanding of what's going on through time, and with respect to temperature and CO2. And so historically, there is no doubt in any scientist's mind that there's this relationship, right? There's no doubt that that's true. All the discussions about climate are what's happening right now, right? Why would we doubt 400,000, no, actually we have 800,000 years of data. Why would we doubt that? So CO2 now is increasing at unprecedented rates. In fact, the CO2 concentration is higher now than it was for 200,000 years before our time. This is kind of important to think about that. If you look at the 400,000 year record and you look at where we are now, no point in our data set, it's true we might have missed a data point up here, but no point in our data set that we have to date suggests that that's not true. So we're higher than that, right? Considerably. When did land plants evolve? The Devonian. When was the Devonian? I know there's a lot of plant biologists in this room. So, okay, Silurian. I don't know what these words mean. A little help, please. Millions of years? Okay, so maybe we need to go a little further back in time. So I'm going to try and do this. We'll see what happens. So this animation I show, I think, at every class I've taught. And I see some familiar faces, so maybe you've seen this before. How are we doing on time? Okay. Are you wondering what's over here? I don't know. So we'll get to that. Sorry, I'm stalling. Okay. This is really cool. This is at NOAA. What's NOAA stand for? And so this is part of their climate data. And I'd like to show you the movie here, if I can make it bigger. All right, so I can't do that. So what we're looking at is data that we've recorded in the atmosphere from 79 onwards. This up and down line is actually the fluctuations from day to day. And this is a running average. Okay, does that make sense? This, in fact, is the basis for that curve I showed you. Okay. So you've already seen this. What I really like about this is it demonstrates how this is changing not in one place, which is what I showed you, Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, but this presents data from the entire planet from north to south across the equator, right? So there's not just one data point. It's not one curve from one place, right? And I think that's missed a lot when we show these graphs. It's not one place. It's the entire planet, right? And so this is happening uniformly across the planet. And this is why it's so important for agriculture. No matter where you grow plants, if they respond to CO2, and it turns out not all crop plants are going to respond to elevated CO2, but we haven't gotten there yet, then if CO2 is their substrate, right? They take carbon out of the air, what do they make? They make what? Well, so O2 is a byproduct. That's a common misconception. What is the primary product of photosynthesis? Glucose, sugars, carbohydrates, right? And so if they have more CO2 to fix, what are they going to make more of? More carbohydrates, more sugars. What does that mean for our tomatoes? They're going to get, they can get bigger, right? What does it mean for our soybeans? We're going to have more of them, right? Well, it's going off the chart. Oh, no, that's the end of the chart. Okay, so that's 1980, big deal. Now we're going to go back in time a little bit, and this is just going to kind of go on while I'm talking. So this has impacts on all these crops, right? So what we have over here are ways we can actually know that plants respond to CO2. These are infrared gas analyzers that Nick has set up. Oh, here we go. Sorry, we're going back in time now. So now we're moving further and further back in time. Of course, there's no data here because we can't actually we can't have measured data in the same way that we have today. And so this is just simply all of these are data points. Now, the reason I showed you this after showing you that graphic is I want to emphasize how many points of data we've collected and carbon dated over time. This is 60,000 years, 80,000. So each of these dots is a data point, right? 120. So we have so much data. Why would we not accept this, right? So this is part of the hockey stick that we've talked about and we're not going to talk about today. So we keep going back, 600,000. Now the Ice Age average is about 185 parts per million. Pre-industrial, now pre-industrial, considering about 1880, is about 278. What's the atmospheric CO2 today? Was anybody paying attention? You're all looking at me. It's 400 parts per million. Okay, that's the end of the show. Highly recommend this. 800,000 years until present. So we have a pretty good idea that CO2 is higher than it ever has been in the history that we can record it up to 800,000 years. If you go further back, it turns out it was a lot higher. But guess what? Land plants weren't around back then. All right, we're not going to go there. So let's think about past trends and predictions. Oh, so this cut off the top of the slide, which is unfortunate. So this is past trends and predictions of future climate in North America. All you see is America. And so this is from the IPCC. Why did I show this data set? Well, just to highlight that we know a lot about what happened in the past, and we can make predictions about the future. But if you went to Ryan Foatstock, you'll know that all climate models are wrong. So some of you did go to this talk. All climate models are wrong, but some are useful. Well, so what's really cool about this is that this is actually measured data. This is data based on dozens of models, and it's averaged. So there's some bad models, some good models, but it's all informative. The bottom line from the point of view of us, let's bring it back down to Ohio, is that depending on which box you look at, now each one of these boxes is things are going to be bad and things are going to be really bad. So these are two extreme climate models. And you don't need to worry about what the RCP 2.6 is. It's really the idea of how much more carbon dioxide we're going to put in the atmosphere. But the point is that our best case scenario is that things are going to get warmer. And it's going to affect us in some way. How is it going to affect agricultural productivity? So temperature's big. Water, lots of uncertainty. You see these hash marks? We're actually really not as well able to predict what's going to happen to precipitation. That's really important because when you mentioned that precipitation is going to affect crop productivity, that's true, but our ability to understand how precipitation is going to affect productivity is challenged by the fact that we're just not very good at modeling that because it's really complicated, right? So, moving on. So how does this affect us in terms of key variables, right? So if you're a farmer and you're growing crops, you're interested in certain data. So how many frost-free days are there going to be? How many changes in the number of frost days? Well, it really depends where you are in terms of what your climate, what's going to happen. For example, the number of days of drought are going to be much greater potentially in the southwest. So water is going to be a big issue here. But temperature is actually going to be a much bigger deal in the Southwest. Very high temperatures there, right? But not so much drought. You see that? And in Ohio, well, it's going to get warmer. So last winter is not going to happen anymore. No, that's not true. But it's going to get warmer on average. So what's the projected impact? I think this is going to be my last slide, and then we're going to play with these devices. So what's the projected impact? Well, I chose this slide because if you're in North America, it really depends, right? Check that out. So why are things going to get better here in the Pacific Northwest with respect to agricultural productivity? Longer growing season. Things are going to actually stay warm longer, okay, and melt earlier. Good news for agriculture, really bad news for what in the Pacific Northwest? Anybody been to Glacier National Park? Anyone? I'd go there if you haven't been there, because it's going to be, there were glaciers here at National Park real soon. I mean, that's funny, but it's true. They're going to be gone. So what's happening in the Southwest while you're talking drought days? Well, for us, it looks pretty good, apparently, according to this. But this is an average of dozens of different crops. Another reason why I chose this figure is because in the box down here, it says, the science, however, is far from certain on the benefits of carbon fertilization. I thought we just argued that increasing CO2 is going to increase productivity. Did we just do that? Well, in an ideal world, it will. But if you have a drought, you have a drought, right? And so the benefit of that CO2 won't matter if the plants are droughted. So let's think about it in a different way. How can we know if plants are going to benefit from climate change? Hi. How do we know if plants are going to benefit from climate change? How can we predict the response of photosynthesis and its effect on yields? How do we know this? I just showed you this figure, and it's saying there's going to be change in yields. How do we know that? How can we know that? And so what I do as an ecophysiologist is try and figure that out. And we can do that because we know that plants take up carbon dioxide. They turn it into sugars. And those sugars provide carbohydrates, which allow the plants to grow, which lead to bigger yields, bigger tomatoes, lettuce. Are all plants going to be the same? Do all plants benefit from carbon dioxide? Well, all photosynthetic organisms use carbon dioxide, but if you increase carbon dioxide, will corn benefit directly from increases in carbon dioxide? It won't. Corn plants won't benefit at all directly from carbon dioxide. They'll do better than soybean in dry years because they're more water use efficient. But when it comes to the CO2 fertilization effect, it only applies to C3 plants. And those are the plants that I study. And what I'm trying to do is understand how we can understand their responses to climate change to potentially increase agricultural productivity, right? And so how do we do that? I guess I can't take this off. Can we change the things? So I'm done talking. So this is a science cafe, right? So I like labs and I like gear. And so what I'm going to talk to you about now is sort of the technology. How do we know that plants respond to photosynthesis or to CO2? How can we measure that, right? Anybody ever wondered that? Yeah. The size of the stomate, that's actually a really good point, right? CO2 comes in the stomata, so the size of that opening is really important. And the size of that opening is actually sensitive to CO2, it turns out. It actually closes when there's more CO2. Yeah, and the amount of them. So stomatal conductance, that's what that is, a stomata, the size of stomate. I can actually estimate the size of the stomate here. You want to do that? So this is telling me that the stomata are moving 0.1565 something millimoles of water. So what this is saying is that the stomata on this leaf, wow, this is the corn, right? Okay. The stomata on the corn and beans actually are losing the same amount of water. Okay, this is simply millimoles of water molecules per unit area per second. This is real time. Right now, the leaf that's inside this chamber, I can't speak for that leaf because I'm not measuring it, but the leaf inside this chamber is losing that much water, and I'm measuring that in real time. So I used C4 and C3 plants because I wanted to illustrate a point. Their conductance is the same, right? So I've just said that that's how much water they're losing. They're losing the same amount of water, right? And they're growing, what CO2 are they at now? So right now they're at the atmospheric CO2 concentration at the beginning of that curve I showed you, right? So the beginning of the Keeling curve. So if there had been a science cafe here in 1960, and they'd measured those at ambient CO2 concentration in 1960, this is what they would have gotten for these two plants. The soybean plant uses the C3 photosynthetic pathway. It's not as efficient at fixing carbon dioxide. So at the same CO2 concentration, it has a lower rate of photosynthesis. Does that make sense? A lower number? Pretty straightforward. But they're both losing the same amount of water. So which plant is actually more efficient in water use? Which one's losing less water and fixing more carbon? The corn plant. Cool. And this is what I was hoping this was going to show. So it turns out that at this time of day, plants are actually usually asleep. So that's why the big bright light, and we're trying to basically force them into just a little longer day. And actually, that's why the reason you see this, that's why you see this curve increasing in this plant, because it's still kind of waking up. It really doesn't want to wake up. We're forcing it to. All right, so let's increase the CO2 to 320 was 1960. Pick a number. 400 already? Okay, 400. Okay, we're running out of time, so 400 is probably good. So what Nick's doing right now is he's telling the machine to put CO2 from this cartridge through the pump into an infrared gas analyzer, which is telling us what the CO2 concentration is, and then shuttling that into the plant chamber, which is where the leaf is. And inside that chamber, the light's on. Can you see that from where you are? It's kind of hard to see. So there's a light on. It looks actually a lot like this light. Okay, sorry, that was bright. So that's sunlight, actually. That's about as much photon flux in the parlance of our time. So that's as much photon flux at this level. This is full sunlight, right? So as you move away, it's not quite that much. But this leaf right now is experiencing a sunny day, full sun. And so it turns out that if you were to turn the lights off, there's barely enough light for plants to do photosynthesis in your house. So that's why growing shade plants is a good thing in the house. So, all right. So, wow. What happened there? A lot of noise there. Why don't we zoom in to 2 minutes? Can you do that? Because we're losing it. Go to, excuse me. Let's show them the CO2 concentration change. I don't think they believe you or me. Okay, so this was the CO2 concentration before the change, 320. And was that Rox that asked for 400 right away? So we're up to 400. And so I just want to demonstrate and of course this could be magic. This could just be like a program that does whatever we tell it to. But if you want to believe me, what I'm telling you is true, then the CO2 concentration inside the chambers is what just went from 320 to 400. So the beginning of the curve to the end of the curve. Does anybody remember what the photosynthetic rates were for the plants at the beginning of the curve, more or less? 10 and 25. Good memory. Okay. So which one was 10? This is the soybean plant, right? And this is the corn plant. Wow. And it went down for the corn plant. Okay, it takes time to equilibrate, right? Plants are very sensitive to these changes. There's a lot of biochemistry happening. Stomatal conductance is changing. So all of these variables take a little while to stabilize. But it's kind of remarkable how quickly they do change, right? So we changed the concentration, or Nick changed the concentration about 5 minutes ago. And we're already seeing a change. Well, this was at 10, now it's at 15. That's a 50% increase. That's huge, right? So you might imagine that might affect crop yields, right? I feel like we should have some music. So, okay, things are starting to equilibrate. Whoa, so this plant's not happy. So the point is that we increased the CO2 from 1960 concentrations to current day concentrations. It's about 400 parts per million now. So we're going to let them equilibrate a little bit because I think they were in shock. Can you zoom out? See the a little more. Yeah. So what you're noticing is that when we change things, the plants are really sensitive to changes, right? And so on a day-to-day basis, the CO2 concentration outside is kind of constant, isn't it? So we're subjecting them to a sort of an unnatural kind of environment, as it were. But this is really illustrating my point. This is probably going to equilibrate pretty soon to the level where it was, right? What was it, 25 you said? This is the corn plant. And it looks like the soybean is going to equilibrate at 15, which is, what was that, 50% more. Okay. All right. What's going to happen if and when the CO2 goes up to, what's the CO2 concentration estimated to be by, I don't know, 2050? What do you think? You were in my plant ecology class. You might remember. Ecophys. About 550 is a good guess. Models are all wrong. Some are useful. 550 to 585 is not an unreasonable amount. So should we go up? Let's go up one more time. Yeah. Oh yeah, so I forgot to go back to conductance. So this is that opening of the stomata. And so before I changed the CO2, I was trying to illustrate that the photosynthetic rates were different, but conductance was the same. And so that was telling us that the one on the right was more efficient. It was fixing more carbon for the same amount of water loss. And so this is the same thing. And I don't actually remember the conductance numbers. Exactly. Okay. But that water use efficiency trade-off should be the same as we increase CO2. In fact, it's actually going to increase because stomatal conductance decreases for all plants when you elevate CO2. So basically, these plants are experiencing climate change inside this chamber. And so that's how we can understand how plants respond to climate change. And so what's even cooler is that there are models out there that allow us to predict photosynthesis as a function of CO2 and temperature, right? You can imagine if you have enough empirical data, you can design a model And if you understand the mechanisms of what causes photosynthesis to change, you can actually parameterize that model. And so you can predict it. So a lot of the work that I've done on the response of corn and beans to climate change was done at a facility called SoyFace. Now, SoyFace is in Illinois, and it was established in 2000 to study the effects of elevated CO2 on corn and beans. And they've had this experiment going ever since. Every year, they plant corn and beans, and every year they elevate the CO2 around soybean plots, and they grow different kinds of soybeans and try to assess the impacts on climate change. I grew cassava on these rings, actually. Anybody familiar with cassava? Anybody? Cassava? Yeah, what is cassava? It's a starchy root, yeah. What can we get, what product that maybe some of the people in this room have eaten is made from cassava? Tapioca. Yeah, tapioca? Yeah, I know, yeah, so tapioca comes from cassava, and it turns out that cassava grown at elevated CO2 does really well. Like 80% increase in yields over the time period I grew it. And the reason it did really well, actually, is because it has a huge tuber. And so if you think about sort of this notion of carbon dioxide being fixed and being turned into carbohydrates, plants that have the capacity to store a lot of carbohydrates, what we call sinks, right, will respond well, right? Turns out potato doesn't respond as well as we'd like, but that's because it doesn't have very high photosynthetic rates, right? So you sort of need the combination of the big tuber, and you need biochemistry to fix all that carbon. All right, so have we stabilized yet? So it takes a while for plants to stabilize. This should be, I should have had 4 of these machines. It could be like a cooking show, right? So you go to the next one, you're like, oh, it's all ready. But this is how science works. So if you're wondering what I do all day, or what I did all day before I came to Ohio, is I looked at these machines a lot, and I would look at these numbers. All right, so I think we've stabilized. Let's zoom in to like 2 or 3 minutes, and then yeah, okay. So that increase. All right, so 15 hasn't changed much. Conductance for the C3 plant still substantially higher, right, than the C4 plant. So at current ambient CO2, the story remains the same. C4 plants are more water use efficient. But they're not stimulated by CO2, are they? Same photosynthetic rate, more or less. All right. Where should we go next? 585. I like 585 because I've done work at 585. I'm familiar with 585. So, okay, 585. So 585 is actually the target set at the SoyFace facility I told you about. And actually, can we switch back projectors so you can so you have a sense of what I'm talking about? So I said it was established in 2000 to assess the impacts of global climate change on corn and beans mostly. And it's set up in Illinois. And imagine that this is a giant field, 80 plus acres. And each one of these little dots is a ring, just like this one. Does that make sense? You see that ring there? It's actually an octagon. And inside that octagon, you grow a bunch of plants. And around that octagon, you have this tubing. The tubing is really the cool thing about this experiment. So let's move on. Oh, Sarah. Okay. So I've already talked about that. Okay. Okay, so I've already told you about what they do there, right? They increase the CO2 around plants. The really cool thing about this experiment, and by the way, this isn't the only experiment of its type in the world. They had one in a forest at Duke. They had them in Rhinelander in Wisconsin. They have them in Italy where they did potato and different kinds of grapes, I think, and And they have new setups being built and they have it in rice, several rice faces. So soy face is not the only place in the world they do this, but it's one of the few. It's actually the only face facility remaining in the lower 48. Actually, the one in Wisconsin has been discontinued. The one at Duke's been discontinued. The one at National Labs has been discontinued. Anyway, so what is this? So it's a 20-meter octagon. In the center of that octagon, we're measuring CO2 concentration, because that's what we're interested in. And we're measuring wind direction and all sorts of other variables. And so what's really cool about the phase system is that we can inject CO2 into the air. So the question is soy face contributing to that 4 billion tons? No, not so much. Maybe 100,000 pounds. And so, I don't even think that much, actually. So the CO2 can be injected around this ring, right? And it's literally blown over the plants. And it turns out the wind doesn't always blow from the same direction, particularly in this area, and this has been studied very well. And so when the wind changes, and we can measure that at the center of this diagram, right? Well, you can inject CO2 from the other side of the ring. And so what this does is it sort of creates a blanket of elevated CO2 around crops in a field. This is not a growth chamber. This is not a greenhouse. This is where they would grow crops, in the place they would grow crops, using the crops they would grow in this place. And so you can imagine something like that anywhere, really. All you need is a CO2 source, and for these size rings, you need about, $100,000 a ring to set them up. So it's non-trivial, right? Okay, and so how does it work? Well, it works pretty well. This is just to convince you that, in fact, they can do this. And so this has been going on since 2000. And now this experiment's grown to include climate change factors. We've already talked about that, Oh. All right. And so now SoyFace looks at the effect of temperature, and they do that pretty cool. All right. This is the last slide, because I don't want to show you any more data stuff. And so at the face facility, they've set up these rings inside those larger rings. So you see this green thing here? So these are mini rings inside the big rings, and these are infrared heater arrays. So now they've got the effect of CO2 and temperature, right? We know CO2 is affecting temperature, so it makes sense to study both of those. So here they're heating the great outdoors. These heating arrays are 4, 8, I think they're 30,000 watts. It's a major heating array, and it's going through the growing season. This is an early season example of how they can actually control the temperature. And so I'm not going to talk about temperature today because we just don't have time. But let's go back to the ergas, because I think we're about to run out of time. Are there any questions? Because I feel like I wanted you to interrupt me more, but it's easy not to. So any questions so far? Because I'm not going to talk anymore, I've decided.
Well, thank you,
Oh, I was just kidding.
No, does anybody have questions?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, thank you. Oh, okay. The CO2 concentration in here is over 1,500 parts per million. FYI. I forgot to do that. That alarm was supposed to go off and all scare us. Yeah. Are there going to be more soybeans? I hope so, because I love tofu. That's a yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Dr. DeForest was asking if there are going to be more soybeans in 50 years, and I think the answer is yes, and that's good news for tofu lovers everywhere. Yes. Yep. Oh, so that's something I didn't touch upon. So I think the question is, do farms now use this notion that because you can add CO2 you can increase productivity? So I know it's used in fruit farming, especially in greenhouses, right? Because imagine that's a lot easier to control the CO2 concentration inside, so you can get bigger, faster growth. Yeah, it's definitely used and implemented in that way. I've always thought that sneaking some pumpkins around soy face would have been really fun. See how big a pumpkin you can get, right? Because they have a big sink for all that carbon. So yeah, that's a common use. Yeah.
Besides corn and soybean, what other common plants are C3 versus C4?
That's a very good question. The question was, besides corn and beans, what are C3 and C4 plants? So rice, so I'm going to go with the major crops. Rice, wheat, barley are C3. Corn, sorghum are C4. Potatoes, C3. Tomatoes, C3. What do we care about? Barley. I like barley. Malted barley. Fermented. Cucumbers, C3. Oh, that's a good one. C4. Sugarcane. Sugarcane was C4. So that's very important. And sugarcane actually does respond to CO2. I didn't have any handy, and is a very important crop in South America. And as you know, is also used for what? Biofuel. Yeah, and ethanol, and hopefully less corn will be used for that, because that's not a particularly good land use. But so, any other questions?
So now tell them that they're welcome to come up and see your rig
Yes.
before you leave,
Okay.
because they can't hear me.
Okay.
I have questions for you, but it's a little off topic.
Okay. Did you get a T-shirt?
No,
Okay. By the way, if you ask a question, you get a T-shirt. Did everybody? Who asked the question? I was. Okay.
until I
Hey.
ran out. Sorry.
Oh, you ran out. Okay. Sorry.
So we talked about land plants. What happens to plants and microbes in the ocean?
Ah, well.
How will those populations be affected?
Well, so I know much less about that, so I'm not going to venture a precise answer. But the ocean does absorb CO2, and aquatic plants will respond to increases in CO2. I imagine. I don't know to what extent. There's an expert next to you who might be interested in looking into that. C3.
Okay,
And there's also there's a variety of different kinds of photosynthetic pathways. Yeah. And I'm not an expert. So yeah, you're welcome. So aquatic systems I don't really cover. Maybe next time. Any other questions? Okay, so please come up if you want to find out what happens when I open this up. Oh, we didn't look at the 550. Did we raise this to 550? Okay. Okay, can you switch this, and we'll that way we're done. And so so this was at 10. Then it went to 15. Then it went to 19, 20. And those are micromoles, it's a very small amount, of carbon dioxide fixed per meter squared, or this is a 2 square centimeter leaf, per meter squared of leaf per second. So what does that mean? Well, a typical plant fixes a plant canopy, a soybean plant canopy can fix a mole of carbon per meter squared per day. Nice one. So anyway, you want to come up? You want to come up here and take a look at how this works? I totally stepped into that one. Yeah.
We'll shut it down, let you guys come up and look at all the gear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't forget, sign up for the expo.
Let me take this
Also,
out.
there's